Gus and Toby stood on the deserted street corner, shivering in the cold night air. They had just been released from their kidnappers, and now they found themselves in the most dangerous suburb of Banco Falls, the town of Firo. They had to be careful if they wanted to make it back home alive. Toby took out his phone and checked the time. It was past midnight, and they had been held captive for almost 12 hours. They had no idea how they had ended up in Firo, but they had to assume that their kidnappers had brought them there for a reason. Gus looked around nervously, taking in their surroundings. The street was lined with run-down buildings and dimly lit street lamps. There were no cars or people in sight, but they could hear the distant sound of sirens and gunshots. "We have to be careful," Toby said, slipping his phone back into his pocket. "We don't know what kind of danger we might be facing here." Gus nodded, his eyes wide with fear. He had never been in a situation like this before, and he had no idea what to do. Toby took charge, leading them down the street with a determined stride. He scanned the buildings and alleyways, looking for any sign of danger. As they walked, Toby explained his theory about why they had been kidnapped. "I think they wanted to use me for my scientific knowledge," he said. "I've been working on some top-secret projects for the government, and I think they wanted to get their hands on my research." Gus listened intently, fascinated by Toby's work. He had always been interested in science, but he had never met anyone like Toby before. Suddenly, Toby grabbed Gus's arm, pulling him into a dark alleyway. "We have to hide," he whispered urgently. Gus's heart pounded in his chest as he followed Toby into the shadows. They crouched behind a dumpster, peering out into the street. Moments later, they saw a man, shouting and waving guns. Gus's breath caught in his throat as he recognized their faces. It was one of the same men who had kidnapped them earlier that day. They waited in silence as the men passed by, their footsteps fading into the distance. Toby breathed a sigh of relief, but Gus could still feel his heart racing. "We have to keep moving," Toby said, standing up and dusting himself off. "We can't stay here." Gus nodded, his hands shaking. He followed Toby out of the alleyway, his eyes darting nervously around the deserted streets. As they walked, Toby explained his plan. "We need to find a map or something," he said. "We have to figure out where we are and how to get back to Banco Falls." Gus nodded, feeling a glimmer of hope. Maybe they could make it out of Firo alive after all. But as they turned a corner, they were confronted by the same man they saw earlier, their faces twisted in anger. "You two," one of them shouted. "You're the ones who got away." Gus and Toby froze, their eyes locked on the men's guns. They had nowhere to run, no one to call for help. This was it. They were going to die in Firo, just like the kidnappers had planned. Gus and Toby stood frozen as the Nazi servant approached them. The man's eyes were cold and unfeeling as he pulled out a knife and lunged at them. Reacting quickly, Gus and Toby dodged the attack and fought back. They knew that they had to protect themselves from the crazed servant of Mr. Walter, who was now dead. The fight was brutal, but Gus and Toby emerged victorious. As they caught their breath, the servant spoke. "I do not follow Mr. Walter," he said in a hushed voice. "I am actually a communist, working undercover in Mr. Walter's club. I am following the leadership of a man named VB." Gus and Toby were shocked. They had never heard of VB before, and they knew that the communist ideology was dangerous and illegal in their country. "Where is VB?" Gus demanded, grabbing the man by the collar. The servant shook his head. "I cannot tell you that. VB is very secretive, and only a few of us know his true identity." Frustrated, Gus and Toby let the man go. He quickly escaped, disappearing into the night. As they stood there, trying to process what had just happened, Gus and Toby realized that their peaceful lives in the countryside were over. They were now caught up in a dangerous game of politics and ideologies, with enemies on all sides. But they were determined to do whatever it takes to protect their country and their loved ones from those who sought to destroy it. They knew that the fight against communism and fascism was just beginning, and they were ready for it. Gus and Toby were able to find a map. Once they did, Gus led Toby to a secluded spot near the riverbank, where they sat on a couple of rocks. "I have to be honest with you, Toby. I'm only 15, Gus said, looking at the ground. Toby was astounded. "What? 15? Are you kidding me?" he exclaimed, shaking his head in disbelief. "I wish I weren't," Gus said, still looking down. "I know I may not look like it, but I'm only 15. Toby rubbed his chin, trying to wrap his head around this new piece of information. "Listen, Gus. You're just a kid. You have your whole life ahead of you. You can't get involved in this game of power struggles. It's not worth it." Gus looked up, his eyes burning with determination. "I have to do this, Toby. I have to prove myself." Toby shook his head. "You're putting yourself in danger, Gus. This isn't a game. People can get hurt. People can die. I know that, Toby. But I have to take that risk. I have to do whatever it takes to survive in this world," Gus said, his voice rising. Toby sighed, knowing he couldn't change Gus's mind. "Fine. But promise me one thing. Promise me that you'll be careful. Promise me that you won't get hurt." Gus nodded, his expression serious. "I promise, Toby. I'll be careful." They sat in silence for a few moments, both lost in their own thoughts. The sky was beginning to lighten, and the first rays of dawn were painting the horizon in shades of pink and orange. "We should head back to Banco Falls," Toby said, getting up from the rock. "It's getting late." Gus stood up as well, brushing the dirt off his pants. "Yeah, let's go." They walked back to Banco Falls in silence, each lost in their own thoughts. When they reached the town, they went their separate ways without a word, leaving each other behind. Asterisk. Gus Blue walked through the halls of Freedom Miller High School, his backpack slung over his shoulder. He tried to blend in, but it was clear that he was an outsider. The other students gave him dirty looks as he passed, and a few even whispered insults under their breath. Gus couldn't blame them, really. He was used to being the odd man out, the new kid who didn't quite fit in. But this was different. He had crossed paths with Tony, the school bully, and had narrowly escaped a run-in with Mr. Walter, a former Nazi who was now dead. Gus shuddered at the memory. He had never felt so alone, so vulnerable. But he had made it out alive, and that was something. As he walked, Gus couldn't help but notice the famous water fountain on the second floor. It was surrounded by students, all chatting and laughing as they filled their water bottles and cups. Something about the fountain seemed off to Gus, but he couldn't quite put his finger on it. He walked closer, trying to get a better look, but the students around him pushed him aside. "Watch it, loser," one of them sneered, shoving Gus against the wall. Gus stumbled, but managed to keep his balance. He didn't want to cause any trouble, so he just backed away from the fountain and continued down the hall. As he walked, Gus couldn't help but wonder what was wrong with the fountain. He knew he had seen something, but he couldn't remember what it was. Maybe he was just being paranoid, he thought. After all, he had been through a lot lately. Gus shook his head and continued on his way, trying to focus on his classes and forget about the strange feeling he had about the water fountain. But deep down, he knew that something wasn't right. Gus walked into room R7, Mr. Donaldson's algebra class. He put his head down during the entire talk. As Mr. Donaldson continued with his lecture, Gus couldn't help but feel a sense of unease. He knew that Mr. Donaldson still believed he had cheated, and the teacher's constant jabs and insults were becoming too much for him to bear. Gus tried to focus on the lesson, but his mind kept wandering. He couldn't stop thinking about the new student, Aaliyah Marie DuPont. He had heard of the DuPont family before. They were one of the wealthiest families in Banco City. She actually went to his old middle school and dated a few of his friends, but he had never gotten her attention before. Gus couldn't help but steal glances at Aaliyah during class. He was mesmerized by her beauty and her confidence. It was clear that she was used to getting what she wanted, and Gus couldn't help but wonder what her presence meant for him. As class ended, Gus quickly gathered his things and made his way to the door. He didn't want to stick around and risk running into Mr. Donaldson again. But just as he was about to leave, he heard a voice behind him. "Excuse me, are you Gus?" the voice asked. Gus turned around to see Aaliyah standing there, a small smile playing at the corner of her lips. "Yes, that's me," Gus replied, his heart beating faster. "I'm Aaliyah," she said, extending her hand. Gus shook her hand, feeling a jolt of electricity shoot through his body. "It's nice to meet you," he said, trying to sound confident. "I wanted to talk to you about something," Aaliyah said, her eyes sparkling. Gus felt a surge of excitement. What could Aaliyah possibly want to talk to him about? "Sure, what is it?" he asked eagerly. But before Aaliyah could reply, Mr. Donaldson appeared behind them. "What's going on here?" he demanded, his eyes narrowing. Aaliyah turned to face Mr. Donaldson, her expression cool and confident. "I was just introducing myself to Gus," she said, her voice steady. Mr. Donaldson snorted. "I see. Well, you two can chat outside. I have a class to teach." With that, he strode away, leaving Gus and Aaliyah alone in the hallway. Aaliyah turned back to Gus, her eyes flashing. "Let's go somewhere private," she said, her voice low. Gus felt a sense of trepidation. What could Aaliyah possibly want to talk to him about that required privacy? But he couldn't deny the thrill that was coursing through his body. Aaliyah was beautiful, mysterious, and clearly wanted to talk to him. He couldn't resist. "Okay," he said, his heart racing. And with that, Aaliyah led him away, their footsteps echoing down the empty hallway. Aaliyah turned to Gus with a mischievous smile on her face. "You better watch your back, Gus," she said in a low voice. "Something wicked this way comes." Gus furrowed his brows in confusion. "What are you talking about, Aaliyah?" But Aaliyah just chuckled and turned to walk away, leaving Gus standing in the middle of the hallway, feeling uneasy. He couldn't shake the feeling that something was off, but he didn't know what it could be. As he continued down the hallway, he couldn't help but feel like he was being watched. He looked around, but didn't see anyone out of the ordinary. Still, the feeling persisted, and he quickened his pace. Gus couldn't shake the feeling that something bad was about to happen. And he had a sinking feeling that Aaliyah knew more than she was letting on. Gus's thoughts drifted back to Freedom Miller High School. He couldn't wait to leave this place and never look back. But he knew it wouldn't be that easy. He was stuck here for at least another 3 years. 3 more years of being a nobody, a target, a victim. Unless something changes. But what could change? The school was corrupt, the teachers were biased, and the students were cruel. Maybe if more people spoke up, if more people stood up to the bullies, things could change. But would they? Or would they just be silenced, punished, or even worse, targeted? Gus shook his head, trying to clear his thoughts. He couldn't focus on Freedom Miller right now. He needed to focus on Banco Falls, on finding out what really happened. Maybe he could even help somehow. He wasn't sure how, but he knew he couldn't just sit back and do nothing. As the night wore on, Gus drifted off to sleep, his mind full of questions and possibilities.